Hello, I'm Robert, and you're welcome here in my busy little shop. On today's episode of What's on My Workbench, we're going to be making a two-layer belt. I've made videos before on the two-layer belt covering some of the different topics. Today, I'm going to try to shorten the video down a little bit, but each step I'm going to talk about the critical points, in my opinion, on making that belt. Because I get questions about the bend over area, mounting the buckle, and all those things. So I'll try to keep it short, but I'm going to cover just those topics as I get to each one. So the first thing that I do and would recommend that you do is know the buckle that you're going to be using. I early on would have someone want a specific buckle. I'd order the buckle and I'd start working on the belt so that when the buckle arrived, I'm able to put it on and hand it over, try to speed up the process for them. Well, an 1.5 inch buckle is not always an 1.5 inch. So the first thing is know your buckle. The next thing that I'll do is when I set my strap cutter for the size of the buckle, I'll cut it on a scrap and I will test it to make sure that where I have it set is good on there. Sometimes it can be off slightly. Sometimes that's based off of not using a sharp blade and you're pulling really hard and it tends to maybe be condensing or stretching out leather, which can affect all those things. So I'm going to start over here. Now that I know that I've tested it and what I have fits in the buckle, we're going to cut the 2 strips that I use. I do appreciate you taking time to be with me in the shop today. And I've mentioned before that a lot of times when I get a hide out, I cut the whole thing into strips and I store it in a box by size. But I thought I would just take you through here. So the next thing I did was I went ahead and I trued up the back. All I did was lay down on a cutting board, long straight edge, and cut a straight line on the back. So now I'm going to cut my strips here. A sharp blade is really important here. The other thing is this strap cutter. You can vary the distance between the 2 guides here, and if it's not set fairly close to the thickness of the leather, things can tend to tip, and that can vary your width as well. I've had people say they don't know how I'm able to match up the width of the belt if I cut them both the same instead of trimming the liner. I do trim the liners occasionally, but one way that helps is since I cut all of these strips at one time, typically, then I have the same width. And occasionally I'm running out of one batch going into the next, so I make sure they're the same width before I start working with them. From time to time, I have people ask me about my leather storage system. It's just a baker's rack. It's 4 feet long. You could get longer if you wanted, but most of the boxes that the leather come in will fit on there. And I'm just working off of one end of it here and slide the leather in there. And I usually try to keep this end covered with something to keep the light off of the natural vegtan leather so it doesn't darken it up. All right, so I've cut my 2 straps. I guess I should go back and talk a little bit about the hide selection first. I typically am looking for a belt that's between 10 and 12 ounces of leather. So if I can get a hide that is 5.5 to 6 ounces in thickness, then that gets me what I need without having to pull this through a splitter to thin it down some. And I have done that before, or I use a different hide for the lining. One of the reasons why I like getting the hide to where 2 layers equal my thickness is that if there's a scar or a scratch in that hide, I can cut those strips and use that on the lining where it's not so obvious. Or if it's close to one end, then I just trim the length of my strap for that. Now this belt here is going to be a 36-inch belt, so I need a 46-inch strip. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look and see which of the 2 is better looking. Make sure that there's not any marks or anything in there that are going to cause me an issue. And once I've determined which is the better looking one, then that will become my top layer. So I think this one here got a couple of marks in it. I'm going to use this one here as the liner. So to help me know which one is the liner, I go ahead and I cut the round strap in on the liner just to help me keep track of which is which. Okay, so this is going to be my liner leather, and this will be my finished leather. Now, the thing I'm going to do on this is the strongest part of the hide is the butt end of the hide. So that's this end on the strap that I cut. And I'm going to look here and see if there's any imperfections here that are going to cause a problem. And then I'll also look at the size of the belt. So my finished belt, the total length, not the wearer size. The wearer size is 36. I just add 10 inches to it. So I need 46 inches from the round end to the English point to make sure that I have enough room for the fold over and for the distance of the belt after the adjustment hole that the person's going to wear it at. So I've got this cut slightly more than that. So once I get it layered up and trimmed to the length, I'm 10 inches longer. All right, I think that makes sense. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to split down this end a little bit to take some of this thickness away during the fold over part of it. So what I do is my fold over is going to be at 3.5 inches. So what I will do is on the liner, I'm going to go about 4.5 inches here and 4 inches here is where I'm going to do my my splits on this. I'm going to skive this down. This is a 12-ounce belt, and that's the specification after talking to the customer, the upper end of that range. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over there and I'm going to split this down, and I like to have somewhere around 7 ounces or 6 ounces on this split. Now, I'm not a fan of doing that on a natural back, in other words, the flush side back, because that's taking a lot of the meat out of there, at least in my mind. But I like this 2-layer because I've got that outside, the strength of the outside of the belt, helping to make sure that I have a good, successful buckle end here. So let's go over to the splitter. I'm going to split these here for both of those. Now, people ask me about what do I do with all of the end cutoffs. The longer ones that I can maybe make a dog collar out of, I put those in a separate box. But the shorter ones, like this one here, I use it a lot when I'm getting ready to use the splitter to make sure I got the thickness that I'm looking for. So, 5 ounces. Ounces. A little less than 3. All right. Three and a quarter. So I've got it set to 3 1/4 here, and I'm going to go to my pencil mark here and strip this down. That feels thinner. Sometimes it cuts differently, a little less than 3. So I'm going to go ahead and step this up a little bit more here for this other side. I have 7 ounces. I can live with that. All right, so now when I assemble this, there's going to be an offset in those 2 splits. So it gradually works its way down. And this thicker part here, when I measure in here, I'm going to put that thicker part here where that bends at. So it's going to be like this. So I've got, I can do the math here. I've got about 9 ounces here and 7 ounces here. I think that makes a strong finish. And if you want it thinner, I have before taken about here and skived down again thinner yet to taper that down. But I don't think another 1/8 of an inch is going to make that big of a difference there. And like I said before, depending on what you're doing with this top layer, if you're going to tool this in what I would say an unequal pattern, you know, floral and vines and such, this leather may stretch and do some funny things. And so you may want to, at this point, to laminate this with tape and do your tooling there. This one here, I'm doing what I call a consistent or all over pattern. So I'm actually going to tool this, but unlike the way a lot of people do it, and I do it depending on the pattern, I'm actually going to layer this up and I'm going to do the tooling afterwards. But since this is really about the construction of a 2-layer belt, the design on there is not relevant to the whole thing. So now I'm going to apply my contact adhesive to the 2 layers here, and I put 2 coats on each. The first one, a lot of times, and it can be somewhat dependent on the leather, but it really soaks in, which is good because that gives you a good bond. So it's almost like a primer coat here on this contact adhesive. And I'm being careful to brush from the center out so that I don't get it on the edge, because that'll mess with your burnish on the edge. So I'll go through here and I'll put 2 coats on. This near edge is easier for me to get, so when I put the second coat on, I flip the belt end for end, so I'm working off this other side here to make sure that I get it you know, adhesive good on both of them. So I'll be back here in just a little bit when I have the contact adhesive on both parts. It's tacky, but not wet. The 2 coats are on there. Now, I always put the face down. It's what works for me in my process. And then I'll take this one here and I will loop it over like this so that it's not on the ground. If it's extra long, I loop it over my neck, and I'm now going to line this up on here. And I'll put the bend in it here where the buckle's going to go. Helps eliminate some of those wrinkles there. And now I'm just going to work my way down here, and I'm pinching here with these fingers and on this one, and that helps me get it aligned on there. And I'm just going to work my way to the other end. Now, one of the things I learned early on is this crepe eraser. It can be your friend with contact adhesive. If you get it on the front, now I haven't used the water-based, so I can't tell you on that. But on the solvent-based, don't rub it like, oh shoot, trying to clean it off, because you'll embed it in it. I just let it dry there, and then typically you can go like this and pick up that adhesive off of there. And I can do the same thing. I'll run it sometimes down the side here in case I had any that I got over the edge when I was brushing it on. Now, if you take a burnisher and you start burnishing on this, you may actually shift it some because it's not well connected. So I'll run a hammer down the center. And those spots that it's connected, it won't shift now. And you could just use a hammer the whole time, and I've also used it as a burnisher before to do that. I'll just do it that way now. You can use a slicker, but this works really well as well. If you're worried about any of the edges, you could you can tap along the edge, but you just need to make a really good contact between those 2 layers, and it'll stay on there. This is going to be stitched, but I wouldn't want the 2 layers to separate anyway. But this contact adhesive, once you've made contact, I think it's pretty hard to get it to come apart. All right. We're going to cut this to length. checking to make sure I have my 3.5, and I've got plenty here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the center where my fold's going to be here. And then I'll measure 3.5 down. And I use the wing dividers here to find the center. And I line up this groove here on the inside on that mark, roll it over, and make sure that the wings are set equally there. And then quickly cut an English point on the end. That was supposed to be a round over. Anyway, that works too. I've done that before. Before I had my roundovers, I used to do English point on both. So Alaska Gary's getting an English point on this end. So now, to find the center here, this is the mark this direction. And I'll just come here 3/4 of an inch, pass it this way, down here, and then do it from this side. And I would rather have 2 parallel lines like that, because for me, it makes it easier to line this up. So I'm just visually getting the center there, and then I can tip this and make sure that I'm centered on those lines. All right, we'll cut the length this way. I do want to make sure I get my English point for that. I had plenty of length. I could have made a round over down there, but I just wanted to show you that that's really, it's just me doing it the same way each time that keeps me doing that. It's not necessarily needed. I've also seen belts where the person uses the round strap end cutter on both ends too. Okay, so I've established my belt length now. And I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna sand these a little bit here, and that'll clean up any variation here. But I think it looks, I think those edges match up pretty well. I've got a little bit here, and I measured it, and the one is slightly wider than the other one. So I'm gonna take it over here and I'm gonna sand that really quickly, these edges, and then we'll get to the next step. So after I layered it up, gave it a quick sand on both edges, I went ahead and created my pattern on here. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that part of it, because it really isn't about the construction of the belt. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use my groover here, and I'm going to create a stitch groove. And I always start at the tip, and I've said it before, when I do that, I stay back just a little bit because I don't want to overcut the tip. If anything, if I'm a little bit short of it on both sides, that's okay, because I'll be putting a hole there at the tip to get started anyway. But it's worth noting, I've gotten before around to here and I'm like, uh-oh, I don't have enough room. So I went ahead and checked, and I just ran it kind of backwards along here to make sure that I wasn't getting into my pattern. So I'll just go ahead and start here and work my way around. You want to make sure whatever angle you've got on this, you keep it the same, because if you bring it up level, it could be, you know, a wider stitch groove there. I don't know. Normally I've got a round end down here, but that works as well. I've got several belts that way. I started off with English points, not the round ends. And then once you've got this completed, you could go through here with a stitching wheel to mark your spots to use it all on, or I'll be using a set of Weaver stitching chisels here to do the work. So let me set up here to do that. So to get started, I use the single tine at the beginning here, the tip, and then I'll work all the way to the other end, and when I get ready to do this side, I'll start at the tip again. And I don't want to mess with this shape here, so I'll just mark it, come over, and I'll do these, and I'll use the double tine until I get around here on the straightaway part. Now that I'm on straightaway here, I'll go ahead and try not to drive it too far in, but I'll go down through here. If you're not as confident about your alignment of this, you could overlap by 2 or 3 holes and give you a little bit easier go there. But I'll come down and I'll put it in the groove, and then I'll make sure that I'm in there. And it probably looks like I'm tipped more than I am, but I tip out slightly here. If you keep that tip the same, this tip this way, if you keep it the same, then your stitch line on the back of the belt will be nice and straight too. It takes a while to get that confidence and remembering every single thing along the way. But just give it some time and your belts will be very nice when you're done. So I'm going to continue this, and then I'll be back here after a bit. So I've set up here and I've been stitching for a little bit here. This is the belt so far. And I'm using the Tiger Ritza 0.08 thread and John James needles to do the saddle stitch. And the way I do it, I bypass each needle in the hole, and it really, to me, speeds the process along, and it gives me a consistent stitch so that it looks the same from one end to the other. And I always stitch back towards myself, like I'm doing here. When I stitch the other side, I flip the belt over, I start back at the tip again, and so I'm stitching from the other side. I think that covers most of it. I'm using 3.5 times the length of the belt for the thread. This is a 12-ounce belt. If it's a 10-ounce belt, you can get more like 3.25 times. But you know, the thread isn't terribly expensive, so you know, I don't like running out before I get to the other end. I run it all the way through, one run of thread on each side. So there's 2 pieces of thread. And yeah, I think that's really kind of the majority of the case there. The needles that I use are the John James needles. And I've had this package for a while. These are the, let's see, here it is. The L3912 COL, and the size is a 1/0. These are a sharp needle, and I kind of like that for what I'm doing here. I do stab myself from time to time, but I see people saying not to use the sharp needles, but you know, use what works best for you would be what I say. And those John James needles, man, they seem like they last forever. I break like 1 or 2 needles a year. So, you know, a good investment there are those needles. So I'm going to continue here. When I get down here to the turn back part where the buckle's at, I'll end there, I'll flip over to the other side, and I'll do the same thing. So let me say just a couple other things on stitching a belt. If I'm putting white thread on a black belt, I will go ahead and seal, I'll create the holes, and then I will seal the belt with the Resin before I do the stitching to limit the amount of color that ends up on the thread. You're going to get color potentially on the thread 2 ways. One is passing through the hole and picking up color. So if I'm doing white on a black belt, I would do 4 times the length so that this first part here that picks up color is being cut away at the other end. That's one area where you pick it up. The other one is if you haven't done anything to seal this belt before you put the white thread on. When you start rubbing on oil or Resin or TanKote, you're going to pick up some color potentially, depending obviously on how well you buff it. You're going to pick up some color and smear it around, and you're going to stain that white thread. The one thing that I would tell you is that when you're doing a color belt, and at the end I tap this thread down, it helps seat it. It flattens out the stitch a little bit. It helps get it below the surface of the belt. But there's one other thing it does. It actually brightens up that color, because any staining that's on the outside of it, you've kind of broke that up some and smashed that thread wide. I do that after I've put the last coat of sealer on the belt and before I create my adjustment holes. And I do the adjustment holes later, as you'll see. It's the last thing that I do on that belt before I turn it over. So let me get this stitching done here, and then we'll come back. We'll be addressing these edges next. All right, so I have finished the stitching. I'll tell you what, the more I see this pattern, the more I love this pattern. This is another example of learning from my viewers. This was a suggested tool here on the channel here. So the next thing I need to do is my edge work. If I was doing a strip that was raw on the back side and smooth on the face, then I would always do the raw side first, because that's the harder one to do. It really doesn't matter so much on this one. So I'm going to use my Ron's tool number 3 here, and I'm going to create my edge. I stop right here with the number 3, and I pick up right here. And I think it looks better with less rounded here around the buckle here, where it's folded over and it's going to be leather to leather on the back side. So I went to a number 2. Sometimes if it's a thinner belt, this is a pretty heavy belt, then I'll do a number 1, just to take off that hard or sharp edge there. So I vary here from what some would do. Some are going to sand this a bunch. I'm not going to do any sanding yet. I'm going to use a natural colored rag, and I'm going to go ahead and start my burnish here. Some of the darkness goes away when the water dries out of it. I think I get a pretty good burnish here from the start. Now what I'll do is I'll go around and I'll do all of that, and then when I put my sealer on here, then I will come back and a lot of times I'll sand it a little bit and I'll burnish it again before I put my last coat of finish on the belt. Now I'm showing you a way to do it here that isn't the way people normally do it. So I'm not telling you you should do it this way. I'm just explaining how I do it, because I'm trying to answer questions that I get on a fairly regular basis about my process. So this is my process. I find that if it's dyed, add like a pro dye to it, that it seems like it even gets a slicker finish easier than just raw. But this is just water. I'm not adding anything to it. You're welcome to add glycerin to it or whatever process works good for you. So I'm going to go ahead and finish burnishing this belt all the way around. I'm going to let this dry for a bit, and then I'm going to oil it. And then we'll be I'll come back when we're ready to oil it. Here's the piece of leather I'm going to make my keeper from. And I set my strap cutter to slightly more than 1/2 of an inch. I cut that strip. I rounded the edges with Ron's number 2. And then to get the length, I simply put the leather around the belt here. And I usually give just a hair more than that distance. And the reason why I go a hair more is because when I do the stitching down the sides of this and I pull that tight, it tends to shrink that length by about 1/16 of an inch is my experience. So this is how I do it. And then I'll go ahead and create my stitching holes in the same manner as my belt. And I stitch all of the keeper and the forming it into a loop. I do all of that with one piece of thread here. I need plenty of thread to tie my knot with on the back side. So I go with 4 times the length of that. And I'm just roughly measuring it out, nothing exact there. And people ask me from time to time how I do this. It's easier to get the thread through there if you flatten it out. So I just kind of mash it between my finger and the needle, and that flattened that out. And I'll push that through there. I've also mashed it on like the countertop and pulled the thread underneath of it to flatten it out as well. That makes it quick and easy. I guess you can use a pair of pliers, but I find this is easier and it's all right here. I don't have to go find the pliers. And then I'm just going to start here at the beginning. And I'll do just a leapfrog saddle stitch here with that. Just like that. I'll be back here in just a minute and I'll show you what I do to go back the other direction. I come through here and on the back I move to the other side and I go back the other direction just like I did come in this direction. And I'll have plenty of thread to tie my loop, but I'm not going to do that until I've got my oils on it and that I have the sealer on it. I guess I need to double check, but I plan on putting TanKote on this. You can oil through TanKote and it protects it from some of the dirt. So I'm gonna go ahead and do this and then I'll be back. I will say if I'm going to make a dyed belt, that one of the scraps that I cut off from one end or the other of the belt, I'll dye that when I dye the belt. And the reason why I like to use the one from there is it's going to take dye the same way. Sometimes one piece of leather will take dye differently than another one. So I'll be back here in just a little bit. I've got my loop here done and my belt is ready here to be oiled. I'm going to put a coat of oil on this and I'll let this sit overnight. And when I'm putting the oil on, I do try to get it on there even, but I don't worry too much about some streakiness to it because my experience is that equals out as the oil is absorbed into the leather. The leather's like it's like an oil sponge. And I do all of my different coatings on top of cardboard and each one's labeled for what I use it for. And my experience is, well, one, you can oil on this countertop, but then I got to clean the oil off the countertop. And if I miss a spot, then maybe I get oil on something I didn't intend to. So by using the cardboard, then that limits that contamination potentially onto other projects. And I'm able to move along quicker. So I've got cardboard for each step. contact adhesive. Each one of them has its own piece of cardboard, and that keeps me from having that issue. So I'm just putting I guess you'd say it's a pretty good coat on there, but you know, I'm not like saturating it. And then this belt is going to have TanKote put on afterwards that will help to protect it from dirt and some moisture. It's going to Alaska, and a lot of Alaska is really a rainforest, and so this will help protect that. And after the belt dried out, I was checking out the edges, and I ended up using some 400 grit sandpaper and doing just a little bit of sanding on the edges and then re-burnish the edges. And I'll burnish it one more time after this oil has soaked in and before I put the TanKote on. But I'm just going to put one coat of TanKote on. I think that's really fits with what the customer or the client is looking for on this one here. I guess the client, it's viewer, right? It's Alaska Gary that won in the drawing on this. Tell you what, this pattern is just really growing on me. I know we voted on that other pattern, but I think I'm going to be doing both of these patterns as new this year. This pattern and that other one, and maybe the ladies will like one or the other, but I don't know. I think I know a lot of ladies that would like this pattern as well, but maybe in a little narrower belt. So I probably will be buying another one of these, but I'll probably do the smaller pattern so that it fits on a narrower belt easily. So I hang these up. So I'm gonna hang these up, let these soak in overnight. I don't think I'll put any more oil on it. I'll make that decision in the morning though. All right, I think it's really looking nice. I like the definition of these stamps, and the oil is dried overnight. I went ahead, and I don't know if I already said it, but I went ahead and took some 400 grit sandpaper and did a little bit of sanding on the edge of this belt. I mainly did that because I'm only putting one coat of TanKote on here. And a lot of times I'll get a coat on everything, I'll sand this edge, and then I'll put the next coat on and get a nice finish. But this has got a really nice finish on it now. And this is my loop here. The oil's soaked in on that. So I'm going to set up now, and I'm going to put the TanKote on. And much like I do with the oil, I've got one of these pieces of cardboard that I use just only with TanKote. And I'll work my way across the front of this first. I've had people ask me if I buff it off. I don't. I just kind of work till I get it. I feel like it's even. And I like to hit these edges a few times, get those sealed nicely. And I wash the sponge out from time to time so that I don't, move contaminants from one belt to the next. And then I'm going to hang this up. And let this dry. I thought I would show you, I've got an old rake head. I have one in my other shop similar to it. I bent every other tine up, and then I sharpened the ends of the tines so that it would fit inside of a 1/4 inch hole, or even maybe a little bit smaller. And this is where I hang belts that are drying from a finish added to it. Sometimes if I'm working on belts and I don't want to work on it for a while, I also just kind of hang it here to keep it organized and out of the way and the threads not tangled. I think the belt is looking really nice. I tell you what, I am just really liking this design here. And so I went ahead, the TanKote dried, and I'm doing my loop here, and I start by taking that top thread and going to the opposite side at an angle, and then I'm going to work my way around this, creating an X on the face. But when I do it this way, it also creates a box on the back, which connects these two sides and keeps them, I think, tightly together and keeps them from shifting. So I'll just continue around here. Now to come out next to this thread on this same side here, I transfer to this side and make this diagonal, and then that allows me to tie a square knot on the inside here. I think that makes sense. Someone asked me how I do this, and I nick this off with 1/16 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch here, and then I just push it down, melting that thread. I just smear that there, and that won't come untied. I've tried picking them apart just out of curiosity, and they're on there pretty well. All right, now that my loop is here, I'm ready to do my assembly. I'm using a stainless steel buckle. I got that from Landwehrland Leather. A couple of Chicago screws. I also get them from Landwehrland Leather. It's got this, it's a Star or Torx bit T20 tool, which is really nice to use, so I don't have a regular screwdriver that slips off. So the way I do this is I'll start here on the, what should be a round over here, but I made it into a point. Typically I'll measure to the center from this direction on both on the round over and make sure I get that centered. And then I will mark here on this other side. You can get a template that lays that all out. I've never bought one, never made one. This is just kind of how I do it. I'll fold this over here and I line up this notch, transfer this mark on there, keep this pinched together, mark it on here. I make sure they're both centered like this. And then I'll make these holes. Just kind of lightly imprint, make sure I'm centered on there good, and make those holes. Then I'll use my Chicago screws. Used to use white glue. I'd forget about it, it'd be open over there, and then the tip would be dried out. I know people that use Loctite. This clear fingernail polish, I've had some Chicago screws I've tried to take apart after they've been on there and dry, and they do not want to come apart. Put the loop on here. my buckle on here. Sorry, I was off the screen for part of that. So the loop I just slide up here, but the first one I put in is the one closest to the buckle. Finish side out. This is that torque screwdriver. I can't remember where I bought this torque screwdriver. I think it came from Weaver. It's actually got a swivel on the top here. And this one here. If I'm making a belt for inventory, I bought a set of little die stamps here. Letters and numbers. I think that was Harbor Freight. And I use those to mark the size. I'll put the size right here. And I'm going to go ahead and lay out for the adjustment holes here. And I make my adjustment holes an inch apart. I have had a few people ask me to make them 3/4 of an inch apart. You can do that as well. And I mark, just like on the other, I mark it from the two sides. I don't worry about making it match. Matter of fact, the two holes here, you'll see, actually some ways make it easier to line up this on. And then a dry fit. Make sure she's going to work. That is an attractive belt. Is that pretty or what? What's the last thing I need to do? I'll use my stamp that I had custom made from Steel Stamps. And I'm going to put this on here for you as well, Gary. I've not put this on belts before. I just had this made for myself. We'll turn the camera around here and I'll wrap up. All right, there you go, a finished belt. I think the belt came out, I think it's absolutely stunning. I said during a recent live stream that I've had some belts that when I make them, I'm like, I want to keep that for myself. Hopefully Alaska Gary loves this. If you see him in the comments, remind him how lucky he is to get this belt. But I think it's just an absolutely beautiful belt made from 2 layers of vegetable tan leather. I'm not sure, I bought this one from Montana Leather in Prescott last year, actually. I don't remember the tannage on this. This could be Sapichi, which is that's an import, but I think it tooled just beautiful. I think the result's good. I tried to get you a short video, but I wanted to cover what I think are all of the steps. There's time to implement each of those steps, the stitching and things like that, but I wanted to cover all the steps. I get questions from time to time on how do you do a specific part of it there. And so that's the process that I go through to make a 2-layer belt. If I was going to dye this, that's the only thing that I may do on others. I probably, on this one, I would have dyed it after I put the tooling in there. And part of the reason why is sometimes, depending on the dye, you may see, when I have an imprint this deep, you may see some of the unfinished leather behind it. So if I run through the dye afterwards, I know I'm not gonna have that, especially if I was gonna make it black. This would be a nice one to put resist on the center here and to dye the outside of that, which I would do obviously before I did the stitching. So anyway, I've talked on here long enough. Oh, I had someone not long ago, I try to pay attention to the comments, but they didn't like my end screen, said it blocked some of this. So what I've started doing is my logo that I usually have at the end, I just make that a little bit longer. There'll be an end screen after this. If you want to, I'll have a bunch of my belt making videos on a playlist that'll be in the end screen. So you can take a look at that as well. I appreciate you taking time to be with me in the shop today. Please like, share, and subscribe. But more importantly, I do hope you have a great day.